I'm Brittany, this is Merlin, and welcome to Gaywatch, where we watch and read gay things. We are continuing our journey through Princess Gambit, which is the second book in the Captive Prince trilogy, a trilogy that is very, very near and dear to my heart. We read for a couple of hours. We take a break about halfway through to go back to the break room that you just saw. Please no spoilers in the chat because there are plenty of people here who have not read the series before, unlike me, and so they are brand new and they would like to not be spoiled. So please no spoilers in the chat. And please check the trigger warnings in the description because this is a series that comes with trigger warnings. And so if that is something you know you need to avail yourself of, there is a link in the description that will take you to some non-spoilery general trigger warnings. Please take care of yourself in that way, and always, actually. So, we are on page 68. We were towards the end of chapter 4, I believe. We only have a couple of pages left, yeah? We are on the road with both Laurent and the Regent's men, headed towards what is almost certainly going to be a trap, and we are trying to prepare as best we can for that inevitable trap. And as such, you know, Damon has had to give some blueprints to the enemy, so to speak. He's had to work with Laurent because, you know, enemy of my enemy and all of that, and the Regent is everybody's enemy. So, page 68 in the midst of chapter 4. When he stepped into the tent, Laurent was sitting in quiet thought with the map spread out before him. He glanced up when he heard Damon, then sat back in his chair and gestured for Damon to sit. Considering that we are 200 horse, not 2,000 infantry, I think numbers are less important than quality of men. I'm sure you and Jord both have an informal list of men you think still need to be culled from the troop. I want yours by tomorrow. It won't be more than 10, said Damon. Realizing this was its own surprise, before Nessun, he would have thought the number would be 5 times that. Laurent nodded. After a moment, Damon said, Speaking of difficult men, there's something I've wanted to ask you. Go ahead. Why did you leave Gavar alive? Why not? You know why not. Laurent didn't answer at first. He poured himself a drink from the pitcher beside the map. It wasn't the cheap mouth-rasping wine Jord was drinking, Damon saw. It was water. Laurent said, I preferred to give my uncle no reason to cry that I had overstepped my bounds. You were well within your rights after Gavar charged at you, and there was no shortage of witnesses. There's something else. There's something else, Laurent agreed, looking at Damon with steady eyes. As he spoke, he lifted his cup and took a sip. All right. It was an impressive fight. Jesus Christ, I knew I was hungry, but I'm not exactly sure that I knew I was that hungry. If you could hear that, I apologize. Whew. Also, I've got some jaw tightness going on today. It happens when my neck and shoulders get particularly tight. So if you see me working my mouth in some kind of weird way, it's fine. I just have some tension going on at the moment, and my jaw can act up. That, and I'm apparently needing to grab something to eat over the break. It was an impressive fight. Yes, I know, said Laurent. He didn't smile when he said things like that. He sat relaxed, with the cup now dangling from his long fingers, and gazed back at Damon steadily. You must have spent a lot of time in training, said Damon, and to his surprise, Laurent answered him seriously. I was never a fighter, said Laurent. That was Auguste. But after Marlis, I was obsessed with... Laurent stopped. Damon could see the moment when Laurent decided to continue. It was deliberate, his eyes meeting Damon's, his tone subtly changed. Demianos of Achielos was commanding troops at 17. At 19, he rode onto the field, cut a path through our finest men, and took my brother's life. They said, he was the best fighter in Achielos. I thought if I was going to kill someone like that, I would have to be very, very good. Damon was silent after that. The impulse to talk flickered out, like the candles in the moment before they were snuffed into darkness. like the last dying warmth of the embers in the brazier. That's a scene break. To kick off the stream, we've now learned that Laurent is really good at swordsmanship because he kind of became singularly obsessed with killing Prince Damianos. It's fine. It's fine. Also, the line that Picard is walking between does Laurent know? Does he not know? And providing plausible interpretations for both the entire time. We don't like her. We're hating her early today. The next evening, he found himself in conversation with Pascal. The physician's tent, like Laurent's tent, like the kitchen's, was large enough for a tall person to walk in without crouching. Pascal had all the equipment that he could want, and Laurent's orders meant that it had all been meticulously unpacked. Damon, as his only patient, found the vast array of medical supplies amusing. It would not be amusing once they rode out of Nessun and fought something. One physician to tend 200 men was only a reasonable ratio as long as they were not in battle. Is serving with the prince very different to serving with his brother? Pascal said, I would say that everything that was instinctive in the older is not so in the younger. Tell me about Auguste, said Damon. The prince. What is there to tell? He was the golden star, said Pascal, with a nod at the starburst crest of the crowned prince. Laurent seems to hold him brighter in his mind than the image of his own father. There was a pause, while Pascal replaced the glass bottles onto the shelf and Damon took up his shirt. You have to understand. Auguste was made to be the pride of any father. It's not that there was any bad blood between Laurent and the king. More like the king doted on Auguste, but didn't spare much time for his younger son. In many ways, the king was a simple man. Excellence on the field was something he could understand. Laurent was good with his mind, good at thinking, good at working his way through puzzles. Auguste was straightforward. A champion, the heir, born to rule. You can imagine how Laurent felt about him. He resented him, said Damon. Pascal gave him a strange look. No, he loved him. He hero-worshipped him, the way that intellectual boys sometimes do with older boys who excel physically. It went both ways with those two. They were devoted to one another. Auguste was the protector. He would do anything for his little brother. Damon thought privately that princes needed seasoning, not protection. Laurent in particular. He had seen Laurent open his mouth and strip paint from the walls. He had seen Laurent lift a knife and in cold blood split a man's throat without so much as a flicker of his golden lashes. Laurent didn't need to be protected from anything. It's the end of chapter 4. We're on page 73 for chapter 5. We're really, off to the races here. Damon didn't see it at first, but he saw Laurent's reaction to it, saw him rein in his horse and move in close to Jord, one smooth motion. Take the men back, said Laurent. We're done for today. The slave stays with me. A glance at Damon. It was late afternoon. Their maneuvers had taken them from the keep of Nessun for the day, so that the nearby hill-clustered town of Nessun-Eloy was visible from their vantage. There was a ride between the troop and the camp, over the lumpy grassed hillside with its occasional scatterings of granite, but even so, it was early to retire for the day. The troop turned on Jord's order. They looked like a whole, like a single functioning unit rather than a straggling collection of disparate parts. Here was the result of a fortnight's hard work. The sense of accomplishment mingled with an awareness of what this troop might have been, given more time, or a better collection of fighters. Damon moved his horse alongside Laurent's. By that time he had seen it for himself, a riderless horse on the far edge of the thin tree cover. He searched the rest of the nearby terrain with a tense gaze. Nothing. He didn't relax. Seeing a riderless horse in the distance, his first instinct was not to separate Laurent from the troop. The opposite. Stay close, said Laurent as he spurred his horse to investigate, giving Damon no choice but to follow. Laurent reined in again when they were close enough to clearly see the horse. It didn't spook at their approach, but continued calmly grazing. It was clearly used to the company of other men and horses. It was used to the company of these men and horses in particular. In 2 weeks, its saddle and bridle were gone, but the horse bore the prince's brand. In fact, Damon recognized not just the brand, but the horse, an unusual piebald. Laurent had sent a messenger galloping off on his horse the morning of his duel with Gavar, before his duel with Gavar. This wasn't one of the horses that he had sent to Arles to inform the region of Gavar's dismissal. This was something else. But that was almost 2 weeks ago, and the messenger had ridden out from Bayeux, not Nessun. Damon felt his stomach twist unpleasantly. The gelding was easily worth 200 silver lei. Every holding between Bayeux and Nessun would have been after it, either to return it for a reward or to stamp their own brand over Laurent's. It strained credulity to believe that after 2 weeks it had wandered unmolested back to the troop. "Someone wants you to know your messenger didn't get through," said Damon. "Take the horse," said Laurent. "Ride back to camp and tell Jord that I will rejoin the company tomorrow morning." "What?" said Damon, "but I have something to attend to in town." Instinctively, Damon moved his horse to block Laurent's path. "No. The easiest way for your uncle to get rid of you is to separate you from your men, and you know it. You can't go into town alone. You're in danger just being here. We need to rejoin the troop, now." Laurent glanced at their surroundings and said, "It's the wrong terrain for an ambush." "The town isn't," said Damon. For good measure, he took hold of Laurent's horse bridle. "Consider alternatives. Can you entrust the task to someone else?" "No," said Laurent. He said it as a calm statement of fact. Damon forced down his frustration, reminded himself that Laurent was in possession of an able mind, and that therefore his "no" had a reason behind it other than pure stubbornness. Probably. "Then take precautions. Ride back with me to camp and wait until nightfall. Then slip away anonymously with a guard. You're not thinking like a leader. You're too used to doing everything on your own." "Let go of my bridle," said Laurent. Damon did. There was a pause in which Laurent looked at the riderless horse, then looked at the position of the sun on the horizon, then looked at Damon. "You will accompany me," said Laurent, "in lieu of a guard, and we will leave at dusk. And that is as far as I will bend on this subject. Any further opining from you will not meet with a loving reception." "All right," said Damon. "All right," said Laurent, after a moment had passed. It's a scene break. A clandestine mission in town, under cover of night with only the two of them. Let's fucking go. They brought the piebald back on a lead that Laurent fashioned by the simple expedient of unclipping the reins of his own horse, looping them and dropping the loop over the piebald's head. Damon took possession of the lead rope, since Laurent had to give all his attention to the task of riding his own horse without reins. Laurent did not divulge any further information about his business in Nessun-Alloy, and as little as he liked the idea, Damon knew better than to ask him. At camp, Damon dealt with the horses. When he returned to the tent, Laurent was wearing an expensive version of riding leathers, and there was more clothing laid out on the bed. "Change into those," said Laurent. The clothes, when Damon lifted them from the bed, were soft under his hands, dark like the clothing worn by the nobility, and of the same quality. He changed. It took a long time, as it always did with Venetian clothing, though at least these were riding clothes and not court clothing. Still, it was fussier than anything Damon had ever worn in his life, and by far the most luxurious clothing he had been given to wear since his arrival in Vere. This wasn't soldiering gear, this was the clothing of an aristocrat. It was, he now learned firsthand, much more difficult to lace when you were the one wearing it than it was when you were tying the laces on somebody else. When he was done, he felt overdressed and strange. Even the shapes of the clothes were different. They changed him into something foreign, something that he had never imagined himself being, more so than the armor or the crude clothing of the soldiers that he had worn. "This doesn't suit me," he said, meaning that it didn't suit him to wear them. "No, it doesn't. You look like one of us," said Laurent. He looked at Damon with his intolerant blue eyes. "It's dusk. Go and tell Jord to expect my return mid-morning, and to carry on as usual in my absence. Then meet me by the horses. We leave as soon as you're done." Another scene break. The problem with tents was that you couldn't knock. Damon leaned his weight on one of the poles and called out. The delay from within was pronounced. Finally, Jord appeared, shirtless and wide-shouldered. Rather than waste time tying laces, he was holding his pants up with a casual hand. The raised tent flap showed the source of the delay. Pale-limbed, tangled in bedding, Aymeric had pushed himself up on one elbow, flushed from his chest all the way up past his neck. The prince has business away from the camp, said Damon. He plans to return mid-morning. He wants you to captain the men as usual while he's gone. Whatever he needs. How many men is he taking with him? 1, said Damon. Good luck, was all Jord said. Maybe another scene break. The ride to the town of Nessanelloy was neither long nor difficult, but when they reached the outskirts, they had to give up the horses. They left them tied up off the road, knowing there was a good chance the horses were not going to be there come morning, human nature being the same everywhere. It was necessary. Where the holdings around the keep had dwindled away, the town of Nessanelloy, closer to the traversable mountain pass, had grown. It was a tangle of close-built houses and paved streets, and the ringing of hooves on cobblestones would awaken the world. Laurent insisted on silence and discretion. Laurent claimed to know the town, since the nearby keep was a common stopping place on the journey between Arles and Aquitar. He seemed sure of directions, and kept them to smaller streets and unlit paths. But in the end, the precautions did little good. "We're being followed," said Damon. They were walking along one of the narrow streets, above them balconies and upper-story juttings of stone and timber that sheltered the street and sometimes arched across it. Laurent said, "If we're being followed, they don't know where we're going." He took them sideways down a street that was part hidden by overhangs, then sideways again. It wasn't quite a chase, because the men following them kept their distance and only gave themselves away here and there with slight sounds. In daylight, it might have been a game played in thronged streets, full of ample distractions, the town active and murmuring and covered with a haze of wood smoke. At night, everything was conspicuous. The dark streets were thinning of people, and they stood out. The men following them, it was more than one, had an easy task, no matter how many detours Laurent took. They couldn't shake them. "This is getting irritating," said Laurent. He had stopped in front of a door with a circular symbol painted on it. "We don't have time for cat and mouse games. I'm going to try your trick." "My trick," said Damon. The last time Damon had seen a symbol like that on a door, it had opened to expel Gavar. Laurent raised his fist and applied it to the door. Then he turned to Damon. "I assume that's right? I have no idea how one usually proceeds. This is your arena, not mine." The viewing slit on the door slid open. Laurent held up a gold coin. The viewing slit shut with a slam that was followed by the sound of bolts being thrown open. Fragrance billowed out of the doorway. A young woman appeared, her brown hair brushed to a high gloss. She eyed Laurent's coin, then she eyed Damon. Then she appended a murmur about Damon's size to a demurring comment about fetching the mattress, and they stepped through the doorway and into the perfumed brothel. "This is not my arena," said Damon. Copper lamps hung from the ceilings from slender copper chains, and the walls were draped with silks. The fragrance was the thick sweetness of incense over the fading scent of Challis. The floor was carpeted, a deep pile that the feet sank down into. The room that they were led into held no flat Venetian mattresses scattered with cushions, but was ringed with a series of reclining couches of carved dark wood. 2 of the couches were occupied, not, thankfully, with public couples, but with 3 of the house's women. Laurent paced in and claimed one of the empty couches for himself, adopting a relaxed posture. Damon sat more gingerly at the far end. His mind was on the pursuers, who would either stay in the street watching the door, or at any moment come bursting into the brothel. Vistas of endless ridiculousness opened up before him. Laurent was considering the women. He was far from wide-eyed, but there was a certain quality to his gaze. For Laurent, Damon realized this experience was wholly new and highly illicit. Compounding Damon's sense of the ridiculous was the sudden acute awareness that he was accompanying the chaste crown prince of Vere to his first brothel. From elsewhere in the house, you could hear the sound of fucking. Of 3 women, one was the glossy-haired woman who had greeted them at the door. The other was a brunette, who was idly teasing the third, a blonde whose dress was mostly unlaced. The blonde's exposed nipple had pinked and swelled under the brunette's lazy thumbing. "You're sitting so far away," said the blonde. "Then get up," said Laurent. She got up. The brunette rose too and made for Laurent. The blonde came to sit beside Damon. Damon could see the brunette on the periphery of his vision, was pricked with amused curiosity as to how Laurent would deal with her advances, but he found he had his own hands full, so to speak. The blonde had very pink lips, and freckles scattered across her nose, and her dress was open from neck to navel, trailing laces. Her exposed breasts were curved and white, the whitest part of her, except where they butted into two soft tips. Her nipples were the exact same shade of pink as her lips. It was paint. She said, "My lord, is there something I can do for you while you wait?" Damon opened his mouth to answer no, concerned about their precarious situation, their pursuers, Laurent on the seat beside him. He was conscious of just how long it had been since he'd had a woman. "Unlace his jacket," said Laurent. I don't remember this. The blonde looked from Damon to Laurent. Damon looked at him too. Laurent had dispensed with his own woman wordlessly, perhaps with a single dismissive flick of his fingers. Elegant and relaxed, he was regarding them without urgency. It was familiar. Damon felt the moment when his pulse kicked in, remembering the love seat and the garden bower, and Laurent's cool voice giving explicit instructions. Suck it and tongue the slit. Damon caught the blonde's wrist. There was not going to be a repeat performance. The blonde's fingers had already moved over the lacings, uncovering beneath the dark, expensive fabric of his jacket the gold collar. "You're his pet?" she said. "I can close the room," came the voice of an older woman, faintly accented in Vascian, "if that is your wish, and give you gentlemen privacy to enjoy my girls." "You're the maîtresse," said Laurent. She said, "I am in charge of this small house." Laurent rose from the reclining couch. "If I'm paying gold, I'm in charge." She sank down into a deep curtsy, eyes to the floor. "Whatever you would like." And then, after a slight hesitation, "Your Highness, and discretion and silence, of course." The golden hair and the fine clothes and that face of his, of course he had been identified. Everyone in the town presumably knew who was camped at the keep. The words of the maîtresse provoked from one of the other women a gasp. She had not made the same deductive leap as the maîtresse, and nor had the others. Damon was treated to the sight of the whores of Ness and Eloy prostrating themselves almost to the floor in the presence of their crown prince. "My slave and I want a private room," said Laurent, "at the back of the house. Something with a bed and a latch on the door and a window. We do not require company. If you try to send in one of your girls, you will find out the hard way that I don't like sharing." "Yes, Your Highness," said the maîtresse, who, by the way, bonus points to the maîtresse, who could not have had it on her bingo card that the prince was going to stop by her place specifically. This prince, who was known to be frigid, knew he was outside of town, would not have anticipated him just swinging by with his pet, right? She's adapting very well on the fly. She led him with a taper through the old house to the back. Damon was half expecting her to eject some other patron on Laurent's behalf, but a room that fit Laurent's requirements was unoccupied. It was furnished simply with a low-cushioned chest, a curtained bed, and 2 lamps. The cushions were of red cloth with a raised pattern of velvet. The maîtresse closed the door, leaving them alone together. Damon threw the latch and then, for good measure, pushed the chest in front of the door. There was indeed a window. It was small, and it was covered by metal grill work that was bolted into the plaster. Laurent was staring at it, nonplussed. "This isn't what I had in mind." "The plaster's old," said Damon. "Here." He took hold of the grill and gave it a tug. Bits of plaster rained down from the edges of the window, but it wasn't enough to detach the grill from the frame. He changed his grip, braced his stance, and put his shoulder into it. On the third attempt, the whole grill came away from the window. It was surprisingly heavy. He placed it carefully on the floor. The thick carpet muffled any sound, as it had done when he had moved the chest. "After you," he said to Laurent, who was staring at him. Laurent almost looked as though he was going to speak, but then he just nodded, pulled himself through the window, and dropped soundlessly into the alley behind the brothel. Damon followed. Oh, if I had... No, I do have a pen. Hang on. I'm making a note. One second. For future reference. Hello. Yeah. They crossed the alley under the projecting eaves and found a dank space between two houses to push through, then went down a short series of steps. The faint sounds of their own footsteps were not echoed. Their pursuers had not flanked the house. They had lost them. Scene break. Once again, she puts them in a sexually fraught context. Teases maybe the outside chance of something, just something sexual, not even anything, just something sexual, and then doesn't give it to us. It is Laurent's poisoning in the first book, like all over again, but in an entirely new way, referencing something else that happened in the first book. Sick and twisted. She's sick and twisted. Here, take this, said Laurent when they were half the town away, tossing Damon his coin purse. It's better if we're not recognized, and you should do up the collar on your jacket. I'm not the one who has to hide his identity, said Damon, though he obligingly laced his jacket closed, hiding the gold collar from view. It's not just the streetwalkers who know you're camped at the keep. Anyone seeing a young blonde man of noble birth is going to guess it's you. I brought a disguise, said Laurent. A disguise, said Damon. They had reached an inn that Laurent claimed was their destination and were standing beneath the upper story overhang, 2 steps from the doorway. There was no place to change into a disguise, and there was little besides that could be done about Laurent's telltale yellow hair, and Laurent was empty-handed. Until he drew something delicate and glittering out of a fold in his clothing. Damon stared at him. Laurent said, "After you." Damon opened his mouth, closed it. He put his hand on the inn door and pushed it open. Laurent followed him, after a moment spent affixing the long-hanging sapphires of Nicaise' earring to his own ear. The sound of voices and music mingled with the smell of roast venison and candle smoke to form a first impression. Damon looked around at a wide-open room with trestle tables adorned with plates and pitchers, and a fire at one end with a spit roasting over it. There were several patrons, men and women. No one wore clothing as fine as his own or Laurent's. To one side, a set of wooden stairs led to a mezzanine, off which opened private rooms. An innkeeper with rolled-up sleeves was approaching them. After no more than a brief dismissive glance at Laurent, the innkeeper gave Damon his full attention, greeting him respectfully. "Welcome, my lord. Will you and your pet require lodgings for the evening?" It's the end of the chapter. I remember this. We're on page 87. For chapter 6. "I want your best room," said Laurent, "with a big bed and a private bath, and if you send up the houseboy, you'll find out the hard way that I don't like sharing." This man. He delivered the innkeeper a long, cool look. "He's expensive," said Damon to the innkeeper, by way of apology. And then watched as the innkeeper sized up the cost of Laurent's clothes and his sapphire earring, a royal gift to a favorite, and the likely cost of Laurent himself, the face, the body. Damon realized that he was about to be charged 3 times the going rate for everything. He decided with good humor that he didn't mind being generous with Laurent's coin. "Why don't you find us a table, pet?" Enjoying the moment and the sobriquet. Laurent did as directed. Damon took the time to pay bountifully for the room, thanking the innkeeper. He kept one eye on Laurent, who even at the best of times could not be predicted. Laurent made straight for the best table, close enough to the fire to enjoy its warmth, but not so close as to be overwhelmed by the scent of the slow-roasting venison. Being the best table, it was occupied. Laurent emptied it with what appeared to be a glance, or a word, or the simple fact of his approach. The earring was not a discreet disguise. Every man in the common room of the inn was taking the time to have a good look at Laurent. Pet. Laurent's cool-eyed arrogance proclaimed that no one could touch him. The earring said that one man could. It transformed him from unattainable to exclusive, an elite pleasure no one here could afford. But that was an illusion. Damon sat down across the table from Laurent on one of the long benches. "What now?" said Damon. "Now we wait," said Laurent. Then Laurent rose and made his way around the table, sitting himself beside Damon, close as a lover. "What are you doing?" "Verisimilitude," said Laurent. The earring winked at him. "I'm glad I brought you along. I wasn't expecting to have to tear things out of walls. Do you visit brothels often?" "No," said Damon. "Not brothels. Camp followers," said Laurent. "And then slaves. And then, after the satisfaction of a pause, Akielos, the garden of delights. So you enjoy slavery in others, just not in yourself." Damon shifted on the long bench and regarded him. "Don't strain yourself," said Laurent. "You talk more," said Damon, "when you're uncomfortable." Damon once again out here with just the brutality. Woo! "My lord," said the innkeeper, and Damon turned. Laurent didn't. "Your room will be ready shortly. The third door at the top of the stairs. Jahan will bring you wine and food while you wait. We'll try to entertain ourselves." "Who's that?" said Laurent. He was looking across the room at an older man with hair like a handful of straw protruding from under a dirty woolen cap. He sat at a dark table in the corner. He was shuffling cards as though, although earmarked and greasy, they were his prized possessions. "That's Volo. Don't play him. He's a man with a thirst. He won't take more than a night to drink your coins, your jewels, and your jacket." With this advice, the innkeeper left. Laurent was watching Volo with the same expression with which he had regarded the women in the brothel. Volo tried to cajole wine out of the houseboy, then he tried to cajole something altogether different out of the houseboy, who was not impressed when Volo performed a sleight of hand trick that involved holding a wooden spoon in his hand and then vanishing it, as though into thin air. "All right, give me some coin. I want to play that man at cards." Laurent rose, leaning his weight against the table. Damon reached for the purse, then paused. "Aren't you supposed to earn gifts with service?" Laurent said, "Is there something you want?" His voice was sinuous with promise. His gaze was steady as a cat's. Damon, who preferred not to be eviscerated, tossed Laurent the purse. Laurent caught it in one hand and took for himself a handful of copper and silver. He tossed the purse back to Damon as he made his way across the inn floor, seating himself opposite Volo. They played. Laurent bet silver. Volo bet his woolen cap. Damon watched from his table for a few minutes, then cast his eye around the other patrons to see whether any of them were close enough to him in class to make an invitation plausible. The most respectable of them was dressed in good clothing with a fur-lined cloak thrown over his chair, perhaps a cloth merchant. Damon extended an invitation for the man to join him if he wished, which the man very much did, hiding his curiosity about Damon only imperfectly, under a blanket of merchant manners. The man's name was Charles, and he was a trading partner of a significant merchant family. They did indeed trade in cloth. Damon gave an obscure name and pedigree from Patras. "Ah, Patras! Yes, you have the accent," said Charles. The talk was of trade and politics, which was natural if you were a merchant. It proved impossible to prize out news of Akielos. Charles did not support the alliance. Charles trusted the prince to stand firm in negotiations with the bastard Achielian king more than he trusted the regent uncle. The crown prince was camped at Nessen this very minute, on his way to the border to stand up to Akielos. He was a young man serious about his responsibilities, Charles said. Damon had to make an effort not to look over at Laurent, gambling when he said it. "Is it Charles or is it just Charles? Is M here? I see M. Is it did I have it right and it's Charles, or is it the very French interpretation of Charles?" The food arrived. The inn provided good bread and platters. Charles eyed the plates when it became evident that the innkeeper had given Damon all the best cuts of meat. The patrons in the common room were thinning out. Charles! It is Charles! Aha! Well, I had an instinct. There we are. Charles took his leave shortly after. Is that even right? The patrons in the common room were thinning out. It was right. Charles took his leave shortly after, heading upstairs to the second best room of the establishment. When he looked over at the card game, Damon saw that Laurent had managed to lose all his coin, but gained the filthy woolen cap. Volo grinned, slapped Laurent soundly on the back in commiseration, then bought him a drink. Then he bought himself a drink. Then he bought himself the houseboy, who was offering very generous rates, 1 copper for a poke, 3 coppers for the night, and who had warmed up a great deal to Volo now that he had piled in front of him all of Laurent's coin. Laurent took the drink and picked his way back across the room, where he put it, untouched, in front of Damon. Spoils of someone else's victory. Although the inn was emptying out, 2 of the patrons by the fire were possibly within earshot. Damon said, "If you wanted a drink and an old hat that badly, you could have just bought them from him. Cheaper and quicker." "It's the game I like," said Laurent. He reached over and appropriated another coin out of the purse Damon carried, then palmed it. "Look, I've learned a new trick." When he opened his hand, it was empty, as if by magic. A second later, the coin dropped out of his sleeve onto the floor. Laurent frowned at it. "Well, I don't have it quite yet." "If the trick is making coins disappear, I think you do have it, actually." "What's the food like?" said Laurent, his eyes on the table. Damon tore off a piece of bread and held it, like a treat to a house cat. "Try it." Laurent looked at the bread, and then he looked at the men by the fire, and then he looked at Damon, a long, cool look that would have been difficult to hold if Damon had not had, by now, a great deal of practice. And then he said, "All right." It took a moment for those words to penetrate. By the time they did, Laurent had settled next to him on the long bench. Laurent straddled it, facing Damon. Laurent was really going to do it. Pets in Vere made a teasing production out of this, flirting and making love to their master's hands. Laurent, when Damon brought the mouthful of bread to his lips, did none of those things. He maintained an essential fastidiousness. There was almost nothing of pet and master about it at all, except that Damon felt, just for an instant, the warmth of Laurent's breath against his fingertips. Verisimilitude, thought Damon. His gaze dropped to Laurent's lips. When he forced it upwards, it fixed instead on the earring. The lobe of Laurent's ear was pierced through with the ornament of his uncle's lover. It suited him, in the mundane sense that it matched his coloring. In another sense, it looked as incongruous as it felt to tear another mouthful of bread from the flat loaf and lift it to feed him. Laurent ate the bread. It was like feeding a predator, the same feeling. Laurent was so close that it would be easy to wrap a hand around the back of his neck and draw him closer. He remembered the feel of Laurent's hair, his skin, and fought the urge to press against Laurent's lips with the pads of his fingers. It was the earring. Laurent was always so austere. The earring reframed him. It gave the appearance of a sensual side, sophisticated and subtle. But that side didn't exist. The glint of sapphires was dangerous, as Nikkei's had been dangerous. Nothing in Vere was as it seemed. Another piece of bread. Laurent's lips brushed against his fingertips. It was brief and soft. This wasn't what he'd intended when he picked up the bread. He had some sense that his plans had been overturned, that Laurent knew exactly what he was doing. The touch resembled the first brush of lips and the kind of sensual kiss that begins as a series of smaller kisses and then, slowly, deepens. Damon felt his breathing change. He reminded himself forcefully of who this was. Laurent, his captor. He made himself recall the fall of each lash on his back, but thanks to some misfiring of the brain, found himself instead in the memory of Laurent's wet skin in the baths, the way his limbs fitted together like a hilt fitted to the blade of a balanced sword. Laurent finished the morsel, then rested a hand on Damon's thigh, and slowly slid it upward. "Control yourself," said Laurent, and shifted in until, facing one another on the straddled bench, they were almost chest to chest. Laurent's hair tickled against Damon's cheek as he brought his lips to Damon's ear. "You and I are almost the last ones here," Laurent murmured. And so, the next murmur slid softly into Damon's ear, so that he felt the shape of each word, made of lips and breath. "And so, take me upstairs," said Laurent. "Don't you think we've waited long enough?" It was Laurent who led the way, trailing up the stairs, with Damon following. He was aware of each step, and he found his pulse beating fast beneath his skin. The third door was at the top of the stairs. The room was warmed with a well-tended fire and a large hearth. It had thick plastered walls and a window with a small balcony. Its one large bed had cozy-looking bedding and a sturdy, dark wooden headboard that was intricately carved with an interlocking pattern of diamonds. There were a few other pieces of furniture, a low chest, a chair by the door. And there was a man of about 30 with a dark, closely trimmed beard sitting on the bed, who propelled himself off it and onto one knee when he saw Laurent. Damon sat down rather heavily on the chair by the door. "Your Highness," the man said, kneeling. "Rise," Laurent told him. "I'm glad to see you. You must have come every night, long after the time when you were due an answer." "While you were camped at Nessen, I thought there was a chance your messenger would come," said the man, standing. "He was detained. We were followed from the keep as far as the eastern quarter. I think the roads in and out will be watched. I know a way. I can leave as soon as we're done." The man drew a piece of sealed parchment from inside his jacket. Laurent took it, broke the seal, and read the contents. He read it slowly. From the glimpse Damon caught, it looked like it was written in a cipher. When he was done, he dropped the parchment into the fire, where it curled up and blacked over. Laurent took out his signet ring and pressed it into the man's hand. "Give him this," said Laurent, "and tell him that I will wait for him at Ravenel." The man bowed. He left by the door and made his way out of the sleeping inn. It was done. Damon rose and gave Laurent a long look. "You look pleased." "I'm the type who takes a great deal of pleasure in small victories," Laurent said. "You weren't sure he'd be here," said Damon. "I didn't think he would be. 2 weeks is a long time to wait." Laurent unpinned the earring. "I think we'll be safe on the road in the morning. The men who followed us seemed more interested in finding him than harming me. They didn't attack us when they had the chance tonight." And then, "Does that door lead to the bath?" And then, halfway to the door, "Don't worry, your services aren't required." When he was gone, Damon wordlessly picked up an armful of bedding and dumped it on the floor by the hearth. Then there was nothing to do. He went downstairs. The only patrons now remaining were Volo and the houseboy, who weren't paying any attention to anyone else. The houseboy's sand-colored hair was a tousled mess. He went all the way outside the inn and stood for a moment. The cool night air was calming. The street was empty. The messenger was gone. It was very late. It was peaceful here. He couldn't stay out here all night. Recalling that Laurent had eaten nothing but a few fraught mouthfuls of bread, he stopped by the kitchen on his way back upstairs and requisitioned a plate of bread and meats. When he went back into the room, Laurent had emerged from the bath and was half-clothed and sitting drying his damp hair by the fire, taking up the majority of the space on Damon's impromptu bed. "Here," said Damon, and passed him the plate. "Thank you," said Laurent, looking at the plate with a blink. "The bath is free, if you like." He bathed. Laurent had left him clean water. The towels that were hung over the side of the copper basin were warm and soft. He dried off. He chose to clothe himself once again in pants rather than towels. He told himself that this was no different from 24 nights together inside of a Warfield tent. When he returned, Laurent had carefully eaten half of everything on the plate and had placed it on the chest where Damon could get at it if he wanted it. Damon, who said, "Wait, I almost..." Damon, who had eaten his fill downstairs and who didn't think Laurent should be able to take over his bed when he had left untouched the vast comfort of his own, ignored the plate and came to stake his claim beside Laurent on the blankets by the hearth. "I thought that Volo was your contact," said Damon. "I just wanted to play him at cards," said Laurent. The fire was warm. Damon enjoyed the feel of it against the bare skin of his torso. After a moment, Laurent said, "I don't think I would have arrived here without your help, at least not without being followed. I am glad you came. I meant that. You were right. I'm not used to..." He broke off. His damp hair, pushed back as it was, exposed the elegantly balanced planes of his face. Damon gave him a look. "You're in a strange mood," said Damon. "Stranger than usual." "I'd say I'm in a good mood." "A good mood. Well, not as good a mood as Volo," said Laurent. "But the food's decent, the fire's warm, and no one's tried to kill me in the last 3 hours. Why not?" "I thought you had more sophisticated tastes than that," said Damon. "Did you?" said Laurent. I've seen your court, Damon reminded him gently. You've seen my uncle's court, said Laurent. Would yours be any different? He didn't say it. Maybe he didn't need to know the answer. The king that Laurent would be, he was becoming with every passing day, but the future was another life. Laurent would not then be leaning back on his hands, lazily drying his hair before an in-room fire or climbing in and out of brothel windows, nor would Damon. Tell me something, said Laurent. He spoke after a long and surprisingly comfortable silence. Damon looked over at him. What really happened to make Castor send you here? I know it was not a lover's quarrel, said Laurent. As the comfortable warmth of the fire turned to chill, Damon knew that he had to lie. It was beyond dangerous to talk about this with Laurent. He knew that. He just didn't know why the past felt so close. He swallowed down the words rising in his throat, as he had swallowed everything since that night. This would be in his head. I don't know. I don't know why. I don't know what I did to make him hate me as much as this. Why we couldn't go as brothers to mourn our father. You were half right, he heard himself say, as though from a distance. I had feelings for... There was a woman. Jocaste, said Laurent, amused. Damon was silent. He felt the ache of the answer in his throat. Not really. You fell for the king's mistress. He was not the king then, and she was not his mistress. Or if she was, no one knew it, said Damon. Once the words started, they wouldn't stop. She was intelligent, accomplished, beautiful. She was everything I could have asked for in a woman. But she was a kingmaker. She wanted power. She must have thought her only path to the throne was through Castor. My honorable barbarian, I wouldn't have picked that as your type. Type? A pretty face, a devious mind, and a ruthless nature. No, that isn't... I didn't know what she was. Didn't you? Said Laurent. Perhaps I knew she was ruled by her mind, not her heart. I knew she was ambitious and, yes, at times, ruthless. I admit there was something attractive about it, but I never guessed that she would betray me for Castor. That I learned too late. Auguste was like you, said Laurent. He had no instinct for deception. It meant he couldn't recognize it in other people. And what about you? Said Damon, after a difficult breath. I have a highly developed instinct for deception. No, I know what you meant. Damon had asked it in an attempt to turn the questioning back on Laurent, anything to close the doors. Now, after a night of earrings and brothels, he thought, why not ask him about it? Laurent didn't look uncomfortable. The lines of his body were relaxed and easy. His soft lips, so often drawn into harder lines, their sensuality suppressed, at this moment expressed nothing more dangerous than mild interest. He had no difficulty returning Damon's gaze, but he hadn't given an answer. Shy? Said Damon. If you want an answer, you'll need to ask the question, said Laurent. Half the men riding in your company are convinced you're a virgin. Is that a question? Yes. I'm 20 years old, said Laurent, and I've been the recipient of offers almost as long as I can remember. Is that an answer? Said Damon. I'm not a virgin, said Laurent. I wondered, Damon said, carefully, if you reserved your love for women. No, Laurent sounded surprised. Then he seemed to realize that his surprise gave something fundamental away, and he looked away with a muttered breath. When he looked back at Damon, there was a wry smile on his lips, but he said, steadily, No. Have I said something to offend you? I didn't mean... No. A plausible, benign, and uncomplicated theory. Trust you to come up with it. It's not my fault that no one in your country can think in a straight line, said Damon, frowning a touch defensively. I'll tell you why Jocaste chose Castor, said Laurent. Damon looked at the fire. He looked at the log that was half consumed, flames licking the sides and embers at the base. He was a prince, said Damon. He was a prince, and I was just... He couldn't do this. The muscles across his shoulders were knotted so hard they hurt. The past was coming into focus. He didn't want to see it. Lying meant facing the truth of not knowing what he had done to provoke betrayal, not once, but twice, from beloved and brother. That isn't why. She would have chosen him, even if you'd had royal blood in your veins, even if you'd had the same blood as Castor. You don't understand the way a mind like that thinks. I do. If I were Jocasta and a kingmaker, I'd have chosen Castor over you, too. I suppose you are going to enjoy telling me why, said Damon. He felt his hands curl into fists, heard the bitterness in his throat. Because a kingmaker would always choose the weaker man. The weaker the man, the easier he is to control. Damon felt the shock of surprise, and looked at Laurent, only to find Laurent gazing back at him without rancor. The moment stretched out. It wasn't what he had expected Laurent to say. As he gazed at Laurent, the words moved through him in unexpected ways, and he felt them touch something jagged-edged within him, felt them shifted at first. A first tiny fraction, something lodged hard and deep, that he had thought immovable. He said, "What makes you think Castor is the weaker man? You don't know him." "But I'm coming to know you," said Laurent. That's the end of the chapter. We're all 4 cylinders today, man. Holy shit. Whew. It is 4, which means we get to take a break. On that note, god damn. All right. We will be back for the second half. Real quick, before we head off to the break, there is actually a poll that is up on the Gaywatch community section at the moment, and I realize what everyone in this chat will answer, but I'm just basically taking the temperature of you guys to see how many people are here for reaction stuff and how many people are here for reading things like now. So it just went up just a couple of hours ago, so I've just dropped it into the chat there for you to go and vote on and let me know what you're here for. Reaction, reading, or both. Both is an option. Both is always an option. So I will be back here in just a little bit. Please enjoy the Gaywatch break room and maybe walk around and take a breather. This has been some scenes today. Jeez, I will be right back. And welcome back. So, for a second, I thought I left the book somewhere where it would have been out of reach, but no, it's right here. So, we are on page, 105 for chapter 7. We've now had, I'm always really interested in, the very first signs of the genuine turn, you know? What's that first inkling of, either real connection or change? The first shift, you know? I'm always weak for that kind of thing. And the way that it has seemingly come across right here is so perfect, and it's so frustrating because maybe other people would be able to talk about why without dumping a bunch of spoilers, but evidently I can't. So you just gotta trust me on this one. We'll, I'm sure, talk about it more as things progress through the trilogy. Whew. So, Damon sat with his back to the wall, on the bedding that he'd assembled by the hearth. The sounds of the fire had grown infrequent. It had long ago burned down to the last few glowing embers. The room was warmly slumberous and quiet. Damon was wide awake. Laurent was asleep on the bed. Damon could make out the shape of him, even in the darkness of the room. The moonlight that crept in the cracks of the balcony shutters revealed the spill of Laurent's pale hair against the pillow. Laurent slept as though Damon's presence in the room didn't matter, as though Damon was no more threatening to him than a piece of furniture. It wasn't trust. It was a calm judgment of Damon's intentions, coupled with a brazen arrogance in his own assessment. There were more reasons for Damon to keep Laurent alive than to harm him, for now. It was as it had been when Laurent had handed him a knife, as it had been when Laurent had invited him into the palace baths and calmly unclothed. Everything was calculated. Laurent didn't trust anyone. Damon didn't understand him. He didn't understand why Laurent should have spoken as he did, nor did he understand the effect that those words had had on him. The past was heavy upon him. In the quiet of this nighttime room, there were no distractions, nothing to do but think and feel and remember. His brother Castor, the illegitimate son of the king's mistress, Hypermnestra, had for the first 9 years of his life been raised to inherit. After countless miscarriages, it had been commonly believed that Queen Ageria could not bring a child to term. But then had come the pregnancy that had taken the queen's life, but produced in its final hours a legitimate male heir. He had grown up admiring Castor, striving to outdo him because he admired him, and because he was aware of the incandescence of his father's pride in the moments when he managed to surpass his brother. Nicandros had drawn him from his father's sick room and said in a low voice, "Castor has always believed that he deserved the throne, that you took it from him. He cannot accept fault for defeat in any arena. Instead, he attributes everything to the fact that he was never given his chance. All he has ever needed was someone to whisper in his ear that he should take it." He had refused to believe it, any of it. He wouldn't hear words spoken against his brother. His father, who lay dying, had called Castor to his side and told him of his love for him and his love for Hypermnestra, and Castor's emotions at his father's sickbed had seemed as true as his pledge to serve the heir Damianos. Torvald had said, "I saw Castor in his grief. It was genuine." He had thought that, too, then. He remembered the first time he had unpinned Jocast's blonde hair, the feel of it falling over his fingers, and the memory tangled with a stirring of arousal, which a moment later became a jolt as he found himself confusing long blonde hair with shorter, remembering the moment downstairs when Laurent had pushed forward almost into his lap. The image shattered as he heard, muffled by walls and distance, a pounding on the door downstairs. Danger drove him to his feet. The urgency of the moment pushed his prior thoughts aside. He shrugged on his shirt and jacket, sitting down on the edge of the bed. He was gentle when he put a hand on Laurent's shoulder. Laurent was sleep-warm in the blanketed bed. He came awake instantly under Damon's hand, though there was no overt start of panic or surprise. "We have to go," said Damon. There was a new set of... Jesus, why do I keep trying to turn 2 pages instead of 1? There was a new set of sounds from downstairs, of the innkeeper, roused, unbolting the inn door. "This is becoming a habit," said Laurent, but he was already pushing himself up from the bed. While Damon threw open the shutters to the balcony, Laurent pulled on his own shirt and jacket, though he had no time to do up any of the lacings, because Venetian clothing was frankly useless in an emergency. The shutters opened on a cool, fluttering night breeze, and a 2-story drop. It was not going to be easy as it had been in the brothel. Jumping was not possible. The drop to street level might not be fatal, but it was forbidding enough to break bone. There were voices now, perhaps from the stairs. They both looked up. The outside of the inn was plastered, and there were no handholds. Damon's gaze shifted, looking for a way to climb. They saw it at the same time. Beside the next balcony there was a section of stripped plaster, with jutting stone and a set of places to grip, a clear passage to the roof. Except that the next balcony was perhaps 8 feet away, further than was comfortable considering that the jump had to be made from a standing start. Laurent was already judging the distance, calm-eyed. "Can you make it?" Damon asked him. "Probably," Laurent said. They both swung themselves over the railing of the balcony. Damon went first. He was taller, which gave him an advantage, and he was confident of the distance. He jumped and landed well, catching the railing of the next balcony and pausing for a moment to make sure that he had not been heard by the occupant of the room, before he quickly drew himself over the railing and onto the balcony. He did it as quietly as possible. The outer shutters of this balcony were closed, but they were not soundproofed. Damon had expected the snores of Charles, the merchant, but instead he heard the muted but unmistakable sounds of Volo getting his money's worth. He turned back. Laurent was wasting a precious few seconds rejudging the distance. Damon suddenly realized that probably did not mean definitely, and that in answering Damon's question, Laurent had calmly given a truthful assessment of his own abilities. Damon felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. Laurent jumped. It was a long way, and things like height mattered, as did the propulsion that came from muscle power. He landed badly. Damon instinctively grabbed hold of him and felt Laurent surrender his weight to Damon's grasp, clutching at him. He'd had the wind knocked out of him by the railing of the balcony. He didn't resist when Damon hauled him up and over, nor did he immediately pull away, just stood breathless in Damon's arms. Damon's hands were on Laurent's waist. His heart was hammering. They froze. Too late. The sounds inside the room had stopped. "I heard something," said the houseboy distinctly, "on the balcony." "It's the wind," said Volo. "I'll keep you warm." "No, it was something," the boy insisted. "Go and—" The rustle of sheets and the sound of the bed creaking. It was Damon's turn to have the breath knocked from him as Laurent pushed him, hard. His back hit the wall beside the shuttered window. The shock of the impact was only slightly less than the shock that came from Laurent pressing against him, pinning him firmly to the wall with his body. It was not a moment too soon. The shutters swung open, trapping them in the small triangle of space between the wall and the back of the open shutter. They were hidden as precariously as a cuckold behind an open door. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. If Laurent moved back even a half-inch, he'd bump the shutter. To prevent this, he was plastered so tightly against Damon that Damon could feel every crease in the fabric of his garments, through which the warm, transmitted heat of his body. "There's no one here," said Volo. "I was sure I heard something," said the boy. Laurent's hair tickled his neck. Damon stoically endured it. Volo was going to hear his heartbeat. He was surprised that the walls of the building weren't pounding with it. "Just a cat, maybe. You can make it up to me," said Volo. All right," said the boy. "Come back to bed." Volo turned from the balcony. But of course there was a final act to the farce. In his eagerness to resume his activities, Volo left the shutter open, trapping them there. Damon suppressed the urge to groan. The whole length of Laurent's body was flush against his own, thigh against thigh, chest against chest. Breathing was dangerous. Damon needed, increasingly, to interpose a safe distance between their bodies, to push Laurent forcefully away, and couldn't. Laurent, oblivious, shifted slightly to look behind himself and view the proximity of the shutter. "Stop moving around," Damon almost said. Only some thin thread of self-preservation prevented him from speaking aloud. Laurent shifted again, having seen, as Damon saw, no way for them to squeeze out of hiding without giving themselves away. And then Laurent said, in a very quiet, very careful voice, "This is not ideal." That was an understatement. They were hidden from Volo, but they could be seen very clearly from the other balcony, and the men pursuing them were somewhere in the inn by now. And there were other imperatives. Damon said quietly, "Look up. If you can climb, we can get out that way." "Wait until they start fucking," Laurent said even more softly, the murmured words unheard beyond the curve of Damon's neck. "They'll be distracted." The word fucking sank down into him, even as there was an unmistakable moan from the boy inside the room. There, put it in me right there. And it was time, beyond time, for them to go. And the door to Volo's room slammed open. "They're in here," called an unfamiliar man's voice. There was a moment of total confusion, an indignant squawk from the houseboy, a shouted protest from Volo. "Hey, let go of him," the sounds only making sense when Damon realized what might naturally happen to a man who had been sent to apprehend Laurent and had heard him described, but had never actually seen him. "Stay back, old man, it isn't your business. This is the Prince of Vare." "But I only paid 3 coppers for him," said Volo, sounding confused. "And you should probably put some pants on," said the man, adding awkwardly, "Your Highness." "What?" said the boy. Damon felt Laurent start shaking against him and realized that, silently, helplessly, he was laughing. There came the sound of at least 2 more sets of footsteps striding into the room, greeted with, "Here he is, we found him fucking this derelict disguised as the tavern prostitute." "This is the tavern prostitute. You idiot, the Prince of Vare is so celibate I doubt he even touches himself once every 10 years. We're looking for 2 men. One was a barbarian soldier, a giant animal. The other was blonde. Not like this boy. Attractive." "There was a blonde lord's pet downstairs," said Volo. "Brained like a pea and easy to hoodwink. I don't think he was the prince." "I wouldn't call him blonde, more like mousy, and he wasn't that attractive," said the boy, sulkily. The shaking, progressively, had worsened. "Stop enjoying yourself," Damon murmured. "We're going to be killed any minute." "Giant animal," said Laurent. "Stop it." Inside the room, "Check the other lodgings. They're here somewhere." The footsteps retreated. "Can you give me a boost?" said Laurent. "We need to get off this balcony." Damon cupped his hands, and Laurent used them as a stepping stone, pushing himself up to the first handhold. More lightly built than Damon, but possessing the upper body strength that came with extensive sword practice, Laurent climbed quickly and silently. Damon, turning carefully in the confined space in order to face the wall, soon followed. It wasn't a difficult climb, and it was only a minute before he was pulling himself up and onto the roof, the town of Nessanaloy splayed out before him, the sky above, a handful of scattered stars. He found himself laughing a little breathlessly, and saw his expression twinned on Laurent's face. Laurent's blue eyes were full of mischief. "I think we're safe," said Damon. "Somehow no one saw us." "But I told you, it's the game I like," said Laurent, and with the toe of his boot he deliberately pushed a loose roof tile until it slid off the rooftop and shattered in the street below. "That's right! This bitch! This little bitch! Oh my god, that's right! Oh!" "They're on the roof," came the call from below. This time, it was a chase. They fled over the rooftops, dodging chimneys. It was half obstacle course, half steeplechase. The tiles beneath their feet appeared and disappeared, opening up into narrow alleyways that must be leaped over. The visibility was poor. The levels were all uneven. They went up one side of a roof slope, and, slipping and sliding, came down the other. Below, their pursuers ran too, over smooth streets with no loose tile to threaten a sprain or a fall, flanking them. Laurent sent another roof tile into the street, aimed this time. From below, a yelp of alarm. When they found themselves on another balcony on their way over a narrow street, Damon tipped over a flower pot. Beside him, Laurent unpinned some hanging laundry and dropped it. They saw the ghostly white entangle someone below and become a writhing shape before they sped on. They sprang from rooftop ledge to balcony and onto a crossway across a narrow street. The careening chase across the skyline called on a lifetime of training in Damon, on reflexes, speed, and stamina. Laurent, light and agile, kept up. Above them, the sky was lightening. Below them, the town was waking up. They could not stay on the rooftops forever. They risked broken limbs, siege, and dead ends. So when they had drawn a precious minute or two ahead, they used the time to make their way down a drainpipe onto the street. The Hijinks. There was no one in sight when they touched the cobblestones, and they had a clear run. Laurent, who knew the town, took the lead, and after 2 turns they were in a new quarter. Laurent led them down a narrow, arched passageway between 2 houses, and they paused there a moment to catch their breath. Damon saw that the street that this passage fed into was one of the main streets of Nessun, already peopled. These gray hours of dawn were some of the busiest in any town. He stood with his palm flat against the wall, chest rising and falling. Beside him, Laurent was breathless again and brilliant with the run. This way, Laurent said, moving out towards the street. Damon found that he had caught Laurent's arm and was holding him back. Wait, it's too exposed. You stand out in this light, your mousy hairs like a beacon. Wordlessly, Laurent pulled Volo's woolen cap from his belt. Damon felt it then, the first dizzy edge of new emotion, and he let go his hold of Laurent like a man fearing a precipice, and yet was helpless. He said, "We can't. Didn't you hear it earlier? They've split up." "What do you mean?" "I mean, if the idea is to lead them on a merry chase through the town so that they don't follow your messenger, it's not working. They've split their attention." "Aye," said Laurent. He was gazing at Damon. "You have very good ears." "You should go," said Damon. "I can take care of it." "No," said Laurent. "If I wanted to escape," said Damon, "I could have tonight, while you bathed, while you slept." "I know that," said Laurent. "You can't be in 2 places at once," said Damon. "We need to separate." "It's too important," said Laurent. "Trust me," said Damon. Laurent looked at him for a long moment without speaking. "We'll wait for you for a day at Nessun," Laurent said. "After that, catch up." Damon nodded and moved away from the wall as Laurent set out onto the main street, his jacket still trailing a few laces, his blonde hair hidden under the filthy woolen cap. Damon watched him until he was out of sight. Then he turned and made his way back the way they had come. Whew. Oh, I believe that's a scene break. Oh, it's just awkwardly placed, so it doesn't really look like one. Oh, shit. I forgot that this little shit pushes a ceiling tile onto the ground. How did I forget that? Oh my god. Absolutely not. Also, how beautifully, hang on, where'd it go? It just happened. Blah, blah, blah. How beautifully and subtly and yet unmistakably was this phrased when Laurent pulled the woolen cap out. Damon felt it then, the first dizzy edge of a new emotion, and he let go his hold of Laurent like a man fearing a precipice, and yet was helpless. Like, how, at least for me, for my brain, for the way I enjoy things, most of the time, this is exactly what I'm looking for. It's what? Technically, 1 sentence. A very well-constructed and poetic and fairly long sentence, but 1 sentence that says it without having to directly say love, attraction, sexual what have you, just, you know. And yet, we get it. We understand. There was no need for, like, paragraphs of sudden realization, right? Which can be done well, obviously. But it's this kind of in the midst of things, and, oh, by the way, also this, sort of mixed in with everything else, where you get it, but it's not so explicitly stated or harped on or things like that. That's the shit. That's my favorite. You can, like, and her writing is so vivid and so visual that, like, I can see this happening. I can see the moment and the look on Damon's face as Laurent takes on the cap. And that is the moment that would be GIFed within an inch of its life on Tumblr, with everybody screaming and pointing at his face. I'm all right. I care about this. A very normal amount. I don't know what you mean. It wasn't difficult to double back to the inn. He had no fear for Laurent. He was quite certain that the two men in pursuit of him would be on a fruitless search for half the morning, stumbling along whatever path Laurent's demented brain thought up for them. The trouble, as Laurent had implicitly acknowledged, was that the remaining pursuers might have peeled off in order to cut down Laurent's messenger. A messenger who carried the prince's seal. A messenger who was important enough that Laurent had risked his own safety on the chance that he would be here waiting 2 weeks later for an overdue rendezvous. A messenger who had worn his beard closely trimmed, and the patron, God, it's happening again, patron style. That's wrong. Damon could feel, as he had only begun to feel in the palace, the inexorable machinery of the regent's plans. For the first time, he had a glimpse of the effort and planning that it took to hold him back. That Laurent, serpent-minded as he was, might be all that stood between the regent and Achilleos was a chilling thought. Damon's country was vulnerable, and he knew his own return would temporarily weaken Achilleos even further. He was careful when he approached the inn, but it seemed quiet, at least from the outside. And then he saw the familiar face of Charles, awake merchant early and on his way to the outbuilding to speak to an ostler. "My lord," said Charles, as soon as he saw Damon, "there were men here looking for you." "Are they still here?" "No, the whole inn is in an uproar. Rumors are flying. Is it true that the man you accompanied was—" Charles lowered his voice. "The Prince of Vere, disguised as a—" His voice lowered again. "Prostitute." "Charles, what happened to the men who were here?" "They left, and then 2 of them returned to the inn to ask questions. They must have learned what they wanted because they rode out of here, perhaps a quarter of an hour ago." "They rode?" said Damon, his stomach sinking. "They were heading southwest. My lord, if there is anything that I can do for my prince, I am at your service." "Southwest, along the Varetian border, to Patras." There we go. Damon said to Charles, "Do you have a horse?" It's a scene break. And so began the third chase of what was becoming a very long night. Except that by now it was morning. 2 weeks of poring over maps in Laurent's tent meant that Damon knew exactly the slender mountain road that the messenger would take, and how easy it would be on that empty winding path to cut him down. The 2 men in pursuit presumably knew it too, and would try to catch him on the mountain road. Charles had a very good horse. Catching up to a rider in a long chase was not difficult if you knew how to do it. You could not ride full pelt. You had to choose a steady pace that your horse could sustain, and hope that the men you were chasing burned their own mounts out in a burst of early enthusiasm, or were riding inferior horses. It was easier when you knew the horse, knew exactly what it was capable of. Damon didn't have that advantage, but the bay of Charles the merchant set off at a good clip. Shook his muscular neck and implied that he was capable of anything. The terrain grew rockier as they drew closer to the mountains. There were increasingly huge protuberances of granite heaving up on either side, like the bones of the landscape showing through the soil. Fuck you! Description! This whole thing is incredibly written, don't get me wrong, but like the bones of the landscape showing through the soil... I'm simply... I don't like her. Don't like her at all. Hate her, in fact. Hate her deeply. But the road was clear. At least this section of it near the town. There were no splinters of granite to maim and fell a horse. He was lucky, at first. The sun was not yet at the midpoint of the sky when he overtook the two men. He was lucky to have chosen the right road. He was lucky that they had not conserved their sweat-lathered horses, and that when they saw him, instead of splitting up or pushing their exhausted horses forward, they wheeled and turned, wanting to fight. He was lucky they didn't have bows. Damon's bay gelding was a merchant's horse without battle training, and Damon didn't expect him to be able to run at sharp, waving swords without shying, so he swerved his mount on approach. The two men were thugs, not soldiers. They knew how to ride and they knew how to use swords, but struggled with doing both at the same time. More good luck. When Damon sent the first man crashing down from his horse, he didn't get up. The second lost his sword but kept his seat for a while, long enough to put his heels into his horse and take off. Or try to. Damon had crowded his mount, causing a minor commotion among the horses, which Damon weathered, but the man did not. He detached from the saddle, but unlike his friend, managed to quickly scramble up and try to run for it, again, this time across the countryside. Whoever was paying him obviously wasn't paying him enough to stand and fight, at least not without the odds heavily skewed in his favor. Damon had a choice. He could leave things as they stood. All he really had to do now was drive off the horses. By the time the men recovered them, if they managed to do so at all, the messenger would be so far ahead that whether he was pursued or not would matter not one whit. But he had hold of the tail end of this plot, and the temptation to learn exactly what was going on was too great. So he chose instead to conclude the chase. Since he couldn't run his horse across that rocky, uneven ground without breaking its forelegs, he dismounted. The man scrabbled over the landscape for a while before Damon caught up with him under one of the sparse, gnarled trees. There the man tried ineffectually to throw a rock at Damon, which he dodged, and then, turning to run again, twisted his ankle on a loose chunk of granite and fell down. Damon dragged him up. "Who sent you?" The man was silent. His pasty skin was patched over with white fear. Damon judged the best way to get him to talk. The blow snapped the man's head to one side, and blood welled and spilled from his split lip. "Who sent you?" said Damon. "Let me go," said the man. "Let me go, and you might have time to save your prince." "He doesn't need saving from two men," said Damon, "especially not if they're as incompetent as you and your friend." The man gave a thin smile. A moment later, Damon drove him back into the tree hard enough for his teeth to clack together. "What do you know?" Damon said. And that was when the man started talking, and Damon realized he was not lucky at all. He looked up again at the position of the sun. Then he looked around himself at the vast, empty terrain. He was half a day's hard ride away from Nessun, and he no longer had a fresh horse. "I'll wait for you a day at Nessun," Laurent had said. He was going to be too late. That's the end of the chapter. What the heck page are we on? Okay. We're on... Wait, I just looked. We're on page 123 for chapter 8. Damon left the man behind him, broken and empty, having spilled out all he knew. He yanked his horse's head around and rode hard for the camp. He had no other choice. He was too late to help Laurent in the town. He had to focus on what he could do, because there was more than Laurent's life at stake. The man was one of a group of mercenaries camped in the hills of Nessun. They had planned a 3-stage assault. After the attack on Laurent in the town, there was to follow an uprising within the prince's troop, and if troop and prince somehow survived and managed, in their damaged state, to continue south, they would fall to a mercenary ambush in the hills. It had not been easy to prize out all the information, but Damon had provided the mercenary with a sustained, methodical, and unrelenting incentive to talk. The sun had already reached its zenith and had begun to inch back down. To have any chance of making it back to the camp before it was taken apart by the planned insurgency, Damon would need to take his horse off the road and ride straight, as the crow flies, cross-country. He didn't hesitate, spurring his horse up the first slope. The ride was a crazy, perilous race across the crumbled edges of the hills. Everything took too long. The uneven ground slowed down his horse. The granite rocks were treacherous and razor-sharp, and his horse was tired, so the danger of stumbling was greater. He kept it on the best ground that he could see. When he had to, he gave the horse its head and let it pick its own way across the pitted earth. Around him was the silent granite-flecked landscape of blocky earth and rough grass, and with him the knowledge of this threefold threat. It was a tactic that reeked of the regent. All of this was. this convoluted trap reaching across the landscape to splinter the prince from his troop and his messenger, so that to save one meant to sacrifice the other, as Laurent had proven. Laurent, to save his messenger, had surrendered his own safety, sending away his only protector. Damon tried for a moment to think his way into Laurent's situation, to guess how Laurent would evade his pursuers, what he would do, and he realized he didn't know. He couldn't even make a first guess. Laurent was impossible to predict. Laurent, the infuriating, obstinate man that he was impossible, wholly and completely. Had he been anticipating this attack all along? His arrogance was unbearable. If he had deliberately left himself open to attack, if he was caught by one of his own games, Damon swore and focused his attention on the ride to the camp. Laurent was alive. Laurent sidestepped everything he deserved. He was slippery and sly, and he had escaped the attack in the town with chicanery and arrogance as usual. Curse Laurent for this. The Laurent who had sprawled out by the fire seemed so far away, limbs unwound, relaxed, talking. Damon found that memory was inextricably tangled with the glint of Nicaise' sapphire earring, the murmur of Laurent's voice in his ear, the breathless brilliance of the chase, rooftop to rooftop, all of it woven into one long, mad, endless night. The ground cleared beneath him, and the instant it did, so he put his heels again into the flanks of his flagging horse and rode hard. Scene break. He was not met by outriders, which made his heart pound. There were columns of smoke, black smoke that he could smell, thick and unpleasant. Damon drove his horse the last of the way to the camp. The neat lines of tents were demolished, poles snapped, and canvas slung at odd angles. The ground was blackened where fire had passed through the camp. He saw men alive but dirt-streaked, weary and grim. He saw Aymeric, white-faced and with a bandaged shoulder, the cloth dark with dried blood. That the fight was over was obvious. The fires that were burning now were pyres. Damon swung down from the saddle. Beside him, his horse was exhausted, blowing hard through flared nostrils, its flanks heaving. Its neck was shiny and dark with sweat, and further patterned with a cross-hatching of raised veins and capillaries. His eyes raked the faces of the men closest to him. His arrival had garnered attention. None of the men he saw was a yellow-haired prince in a woolen cap. And just as he feared the worst, just as all that he had not let himself believe for the long ride began to push itself to the front of his mind, Damon saw him, drawn out of one of the mostly intact tents not 6 steps away, and gone still at the sight of Damon. He was not wearing the woolen cap. His newly minted hair was uncovered, and he looked as fresh as he had emerging from the baths the night before, as he had waking beneath Damon's hands. But he had resumed the cool restraint, his jacket laced, his expression disagreeable from the haughty profile to the intolerant blue eyes. "You're alive," Damon said, and the words came out on a rush of relief that made him feel weak. "I'm alive," said Laurent. They were gazing at one another. "I wasn't sure you'd come back." "I came back," said Damon. Anything else that he might have said was forestalled by the arrival of Jord. "You missed the excitement," said Jord, "but you're in time for the cleanup. It's over." "It's not over," said Damon, and he told them what he knew. That was a scene break. Yeah, Jamie is correct. Like, there's a burned camp, guys. We can do the gazing and the, oh my god, you came back. Like, in a minute. Not that I'm actually arguing. "We don't have to ride through the pass," said Jord. "We can detour and find another way south. These mercenaries may have been hired to lay ambush, but I doubt they'll follow an army through the heart of its own lands." They sat in Laurent's tent. With the damage of the insurgency still awaiting his attention outside, Jord had reacted to Damon's warning of an ambush as to a blow. He had tried to hide it, but he was surprised, demoralized. Laurent had shown no reaction whatsoever. Damon tried to stop looking at Laurent. He had 100 questions. How had he escaped his pursuers? Had it been easy, difficult? Had he suffered any injury? Was he all right? Oh, honey. Oh, honey. You know, it was already gay at Damon tried to stop looking at Laurent, and then from there we're digging our own queer ass graves. Woo. He could ask none of them. Instead, Damon forced his eyes down to the map spread out on the table. The fight took precedence. He passed a hand over his face, sweeping away any weariness, and oriented himself in the situation. He said, "No, I don't think we should detour. I think we should face them. Now. Tonight." "Tonight? We've barely recovered from the bloodshed this morning," said Jord. "I know that. They know that. If you want to have any chance of taking them by surprise, it has to be tonight." He had heard from Jord the short, brutal story of the uprising within the camp. The news was bad, but it was better than he had feared. It was better than it had appeared when he had first ridden into the camp. It had begun mid-morning, in Laurent's absence. There had been a small handful of instigators. To Damon it seemed obvious that the uprising was planned, that the instigators were paid, and that their plan had relied on the fact that the rest of the regent's men, rabble-rousers, thugs, and mercenaries looking for an outlet, would take the first excuse to lash out at the prince's men and join in. They would have, 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, the troop had been a rabble split into two factions. They had not developed the fledgling camaraderie that now held them together. They hadn't been sent to their sleeping roles night after night, exhausted from trying to outdo one another at some mad, impossible exercise, finding to their surprise that after they had stopped cursing their prince's name, how much they had enjoyed themselves. If Gaywatch had been in charge, it would have been pandemonium. It would have been faction against faction, the troops splintered, fractured, and bearing grudges, and captained by a man who did not wish the company to survive. Instead, the uprising had been swiftly thwarted. It had been bloody but brief. No more than 24 men were dead. There was minor damage to tents and stores. It could have been far, far worse. Damon thought of all the ways that this might have played out. Laurent dead, or returned to find his troop in tatters, his messenger cut down on the road. Laurent was alive. The troop was intact. The messenger had survived. This day was a victory, except that the men didn't feel it. They needed to feel it. They needed to fight something and to win. He pushed the sleep fog from his mind and tried to put that into words. These men can fight. They just need to know it. You don't have to let the threat of attack chase you halfway across the mountains. You can stand and fight, he said. It's not an army. It's a group of mercenaries small enough to camp in the hills without being noticed. "They're big hills," said Jord. And then, "If you're right, they're camped and watching us with scouts. The second we ride out, they'll know it. That's why our best chance is to do it now. We're not expected and we'll have the cover of night." Jord was shaking his head. Better to avoid the fight. Laurent, who had allowed this argument to develop, now with a slight gesture indicated that it should cease. Damon found that Laurent's gaze was on him. A long, impenetrable look. "I prefer to think my way out of traps," said Laurent, "rather than use brute force to simply smash through." The words had the air of finality to them. Damon nodded and began to rise when Laurent's cool voice stopped him. "That's why I think we should fight," said Laurent. "It's the last thing I would ever do, and the last thing that anyone, knowing me, would expect." "Your Highness," began Jord. "No," said Laurent. "I have made my decision. Call in Lazare, and Huet, he knows the hill. We plan the fight." Jord obeyed, and for a brief moment Damon and Laurent were left alone together. "I didn't think you'd say yes," said Damon. Laurent said, "I have recently learned that sometimes it is better to simply smash a hole in the wall." That's a scene break. There was no time, then, for anything but preparations. They were to ride out at nightfall, as Laurent announced when he addressed the men. To strike with any chance of success, they must work swiftly, as they had never worked. There was a great deal to prove. They had just had their nose bloodied, and now was the moment when they either crawled away sniveling or proved themselves man enough to return the blow and fight. It was a succinct speech that was equal parts rallying and infuriating, but it certainly had the effect of provoking the men into action, of taking the sullen, nervy energy of the troop, forging it into something usable, and directing it outward. Damon had been right. They wanted to fight. There was a determination among many of them now that was replacing weariness. Damon heard one of the men mutter that they would hit the ambushers before they knew what was coming. Another swore that he would strike a blow for his fallen comrade. As he worked, Damon learned the full extent of the damage done by the uprising, some of it unexpected. Asking the whereabouts of Orlan, he was told, simply, "Orlan's dead." "Dead," said Damon. "He was killed by one of the insurgents?" "He was one of the insurgents," he was told, shortly. "He attacked the prince as he was returning to camp. Aymeric was there. He was the one who took Orlan down. Got caught up doing it." Oh, I forgot about Orlan. Oh, shit. Fuck. We liked Orlan. Damn. Damn. Ah. Shit. He remembered Aymeric's tense white face and thought it best, before riding out into a fight, to check on the boy. He grew concerned when he heard from one of the prince's men that Aymeric had left the camp. He followed the man's finger point. Pushing his way through the trees, he saw Aymeric, who was standing with one hand on the twisted branch of a tree, as though for support. Damon almost hailed him, but then he saw that Jord was weaving through the scattered trees, following Aymeric. Damon stayed silent, not announcing his presence. Jord put a hand on Aymeric's back. "After the first few times, you stopped throwing up," he heard Jord say. "I'm fine," said Aymeric. "I'm fine. I've never killed anyone before. I'll be fine." "It's not an easy thing," said Jord. "For anyone." And then, "He was a traitor. He would have killed the prince. Or you. Or me." "A traitor," Aymeric echoed hollowly. "Would you have killed him for that? He was your friend." And then he said it again in a different voice. "He was your friend." Jord murmured something that was too soft to hear, and Aymeric let himself be folded into Jord's arms. They stayed that way for a long moment, under the swaying branches of the trees. And then Damon saw Aymeric's hands slide into Jord's hair, heard him say, "Kiss me, please, I want..." And he stepped away to give them privacy, as Jord tilted Aymeric's chin up, as the branches of the trees moved back and forth, a gentle shifting veil covering them up. Fighting at night was not ideal. In the dark, friend and foe were one. In the dark, the terrain took on new importance. The hills of Nessun were rocky and fissured, as Damon now knew intimately, having scoured them with his eyes for hours on the ride that day, picking out a path for his horse. And that was during daylight. But in some ways it was a standard mission for a small troop. Raids from the Vaskian mountains were troublesome to many townships, not only in Ver, but also in Patras and northern Achielos. It was not uncommon for a commander to be sent with a party to clean raiders out of the foothills. Nicandros, the Kairos of Delpha, had spent half his time doing just that and the other half petitioning the king for monies, on the grounds that the Vaskian raiders he was dealing with were in fact supplied and funded by Ver. The maneuver itself was simple. There were several sites where the mercenaries might be camped. Rather than playing the odds, they were simply going to draw them out. Damon and the group of 50 men he led were the bait. With them were the wagons that mimicked the appearance of a full troop making an attempt at tiptoeing their way stealthily south, under cover of night. When the enemy attacked, they would appear to fall back, and instead led the way to the remainder of the troop led by Laurent. The two groups would trap the attackers between them, cutting off any escape. Simple. Some of the men had experience with this kind of fighting. They were also at least somewhat familiar with night missions. They had been hoisted out of their beds more than once during the time they'd spent at Nessun, and set to work in the dark. Those were their advantages, alongside the hoped-for element of surprise that would leave their attackers scrambling and disorganized. But there had been no time for scouts, and of the men in the troop, only Hue had, I believe I got that right, had even a hazy knowledge of this particular piece of ground. Lack of familiarity with the terrain had been a concern from the start, and as they rode, carts and wagons trundling behind, cheerfully making the right amount of muted noise to announce their presence to anyone scouting for them, the ground around them changed. Granite cliffs heaved up on either side, and the road was becoming a mountain road, with a gentle but steepening slope to the left and a sheer rock face to the right. It was different enough from the terrain that Hue had imperfectly described to cause concern. Damon looked again at the cliffs and realized his concentration was slipping. It occurred to him that it was his second night in a row without sleep. He shook his head to clear it. It was not the right terrain for an ambush, or at least not the type of ambush for which they had prepared. There was no place in the terrain above them for any group of sufficient size to lie in wait with bows, nor could men ride down those cliffs to attack, and no one in their right mind would attack from below. Something was wrong. He reined his horse in, hard, suddenly aware of the true danger of this location. "Stop!" he sent up the call. "We need to get off the road. Leave the wagons and ride for that tree line now." He saw the flash of confusion in Lazar's eyes and thought for a single heart-pounding second that his order might not be followed, despite the authority that Laurent had lent him for this mission, because he was a slave. But his words carried. Lazar was the first to move, then the others followed. First the tail of the column, reining around the wagons, then the middle section, and finally the head. Too slow, thought Damon, as they struggled past the abandoned wagons. A moment later they heard the sound. It was not the hiss and spit of arrows or the metallic sound of swords. Instead, there was a faint rumbling, a sound familiar to Damon, who had grown up on the cliffs of Ios, the high white cliffs that every now and again during his childhood would crack, break off, and tumble into the sea. It was a rock fall. "Ride!" went the call, and the individuals of the troop became a single lurching, streaming mass of horseflesh pounding towards the trees. The first of the men reached the tree line moments before the sound became a roar, the crack and crash of stones, of huge granite boulders large enough to smash into other parts of the cliff and send them driving downwards. The thundering sound, echoing off the walls of the mountain, was frightening and panicked the horses almost more than the boulders at their heels. It was as though the whole surface of the cliff loosened, dissolved into a liquid surface, a rain of stone, a rolling wave of stone. Wheeling, racing, plunging into the trees, not everyone saw the rockfall hit the road where they had been moments before, cutting them off from the wagons, but falling short of the tree line, as Damon had predicted. As the dust cleared, the men, coughing, steadied their horses and found their stirrups. Looking about themselves, they found they were intact in number, and while they were cut off from the wagons, they were not cut off from their prince and the other half of their band, as they would have been if not for this ride, the rockfall slicing the road. Damon dug in his spurs and forced his horse back to the edge of the road, giving the order for the company to ride for their prince. It was a hard, breathless ride. They arrived at the distant ridge of black trees just in time to see a streak of black shapes detach from the ridge and attack the prince's convoy, in a maneuver that was supposed to split the prince's troop in half, but which was prevented from doing so by Damon and the 50 horse he brought with him, riding into their attack, wrecking their lines, and disrupting their momentum. And then they were in the thick of it, fighting. In the dense forest of slash and thrust, Damon saw that their attackers were indeed mercenaries, and that after the initial attack they had little in the way of tactics holding them together. Whether this disorganization was indeed due to the speed with which they had been forced to muster, he couldn't know, but certainly they had been surprised by the arrival of Damon and his men. Their own lines held, their discipline held. Damon took point and saw Jord and Lazar close by on the front. He caught a glimpse of Aymeric, looking pinched and white, but fighting with the same determination he had shown during the drills when he had pushed himself almost to exhaustion to keep up with the other men. Their attackers fell back or simply fell. Pulling his sword from the man who had tried to knife him, Damon saw the mercenary at his right fall victim to a precise killing. "I thought you were supposed to be the bait," said Laurent. "There was a change of plan," said Damon. There was another brief burst of close fighting. He felt the shift, the moment when the fight was won. "Form up, make a line," Jord was saying. Of the attackers, most were dead. Some had surrendered. It was over. Perched on the side of a mountain, they had won. A cheer went up, and even Damon, whose standards in these situations were exacting, found he was satisfied with the outcome, considering the quality of the troop and the fighting conditions. This was a job well done. When the lines were formed and heads were counted, it turned out they had only lost 2 men. Apart from that, a few slices, a few cuts. It would give Pascal something to do, the men said. Victory buoyed everyone. Not even the revelation that they must now dig out their supplies and see about making camp could dampen the happy spirits of the men. Those who had ridden with Damon were particularly proud. They hammered each other on the back and boasted to the others about their escape from the rockfall, which, when they returned to the site to see about unearthing the wagons, everyone agreed was impressive. In fact, only one of the wagons was smashed beyond repair. It was not the one that held the food or the mouth-rasping wine, another cause for cheer. This time the men hammered Damon on the back. He had achieved new status among them as the quick thinker who had saved half the men and all of the wine. They made camp in record time, and when Damon looked out at the neat lines of the tents, he found himself smiling. I believe... Oh, no. We're almost to the end of the chapter. That's a scene break. It was not all revelry and relaxation, as there was inventory to be made, repairs to be started, outriders to be assigned, and men to be set on guard. But the campfires were lit, the wine was passed around, and the mood was jovial. Caught between duties, Damon saw Laurent speaking with Jord on the far side of the camp, and when Laurent's business with Jord was done, he made his way over. "You're not celebrating," said Damon. He leaned his back against the tree beside Laurent, and let his limbs feel heavy. The sounds of merriment and success drifted over to them, the men drunk on the euphoria of victory, sleeplessness, and bad wine. It would be dawn again. It would be dawn soon again. "I'm not used to my uncle miscalculating," said Laurent, after a pause. "It's because he's working at a distance," said Damon. "It's because of you," said Laurent. "What?" "He doesn't know how to predict you," said Laurent. "After what I did to you in Arles, he thought you'd be another Gauvard, another one of his men, another one of those men today, ready to mutiny at a moment's notice. That was what was supposed to have happened tonight." Laurent's gaze passed calmly, critically, over the troop, before it came to rest on Damon. "Instead, you have saved my life more than once. You have made fighters of these men, trained them, honed them. Tonight you handed me my first victory. My uncle never dreamed you'd be this kind of asset to me. If he had, he would never have allowed you to ride out of the palace." He could see in Laurent's eyes, hear in his words, a question that he did not want to answer. He said, "I should go and help with repairs." He pushed away from the tree. He felt an odd dizziness, a sense of displacement, and to his surprise, he was prevented from moving off by Laurent's hand clasping his arm. He looked down at it. He thought for a strange moment that it was the first time Laurent had ever touched him, though of course it wasn't. The grip was more intimate than the flutter of Laurent's lips against his fingertips, the sting of Laurent striking his face, or the press of Laurent's body in a confined space. "Leave the repairs," said Laurent. His voice was soft. "Get some sleep." "I'm fine," said Damon. "It's an order," said Laurent. He was fine, but he had no choice but to do as he was told. And when he tumbled onto his slave pallet and closed his eyes for the first time in 2 long days and nights, sleep was there, heavy and immediate, drawing him down past the strange new feeling in his chest into oblivion. It just makes you want to shriek at the top of your lungs, but you can't, because your wife has gotten home, and she's probably in the shower, and if you screamed, she would just come in running naked from the shower thinking that you were dying, and then all of a sudden, nudity is being streamed out onto YouTube, and my channel vanishes again. So we're just gonna sit here and breathe for a second. I really don't like CS Picard. Jesus. I'm okay. I did not tell you what page we're on or what chapter we're on. It's page 141 for chapter 9. That is where we get to pick up on Thursday. So, why does it feel like everything happened? Everything happened. We're now just a little under halfway through Princess Gambit. And like so much happened in these roughly 70 pages. It reads so smoothly. It just exists so seemingly effortlessly. How? I have a few links to C.S. Pacat interviews about Princess Gambit in particular. And boy, I'm so tempted to try to figure out how to, like, I don't know, like, react to it on the Patreon or watch along. I don't know if it would really make sense to be a YouTube thing, because it would literally just be me watching C.S. Pacat talk about Captive Prince and then me going like full writer nerd. So like, I don't know. I don't know, but the temptation is there. It's so there, because I could talk about this series for a very long time, but it's after 5 and I have to go. So I'm gonna go. Oh, you would think it would be a live stream thing, the C.S. Pacat interview thing, but I'm not entirely sure it could be live streamed for like copyright reasons. YouTube can be weird about streaming stuff like that. Like, I don't know what would and would not get like copyright, so I don't know. If you have an idea, please drop it like in a comment on this video as to like how to do that. Or, I mean, really, if you would be interested in a video like that and you think that it should land on YouTube and not just be a Patreon thing, also comment down below and let me know. Because if it's appropriate for the YouTube almighty algorithm gods, then I will very much put that here. Because I would love to. I'm dying. I am fully fucking dying. Just about everything in general all the time. That's why this channel exists, to be honest. Whew. All right. I'll be here on Thursday for another 70-ish pages, I believe, as we go through the midpoint of Princess Gambit tomorrow. Yeah, I'm excited. I'm a little excited. I'm a little terribly excited. So I'll see you on Thursday. Please take care of yourself. Please, please, please. For the love of all that is holy, please take care of yourselves. I hope you're having a good week. And I hope if you're having a shit beginning of your week, I hope it gets markedly better for you. Please. And I will see you on Thursday, regardless, for more Captive Prince and Princess Gambit. Alrighty? I will see you guys then.